Hey, welcome to the Night Scientist of the Internet. I'm so happy you're here with me today. You know, there's something truly magical about taking a moment to slow down and explore the incredible stories that surround us every single day. Whether you're settling in with a warm cup of tea, finding a quiet moment in your busy schedule, or simply looking for something to help you unwind, I want you to know that this is your space to breathe, to wonder, and to discover something beautiful together. I've always believed that the most extraordinary tales are often hidden in plain sight, waiting patiently for someone to notice them, to listen carefully to what they have to say. Today, I want to share with you one of nature's most incredible stories, one that has been unfolding for thousands upon thousands of years, shaping entire landscapes, nurturing countless forms of life, and connecting distant corners of our world in the most remarkable ways. So please, get comfortable, let your shoulders relax and allow yourself to be carried away on a journey that begins in the silent, frozen heights of ancient glaciers and winds its way through valleys, forests, and cities until it finally reaches the vast, welcoming embrace of the ocean. This is a story of patience, persistence, and the quiet power of water to transform everything it touches. Today, we are diving into the fascinating world of the story of a river from glacier to delta. This isn't just a tale about water flowing downhill, though that's certainly part of it. No, this is a story about time itself, about the slow, steady work of nature, about how something as simple as a single drop of melted ice can eventually become part of something magnificent and life-giving. It's about the journey from the highest, most remote places on Earth to the bustling deltas where rivers meet the sea, bringing with them the stories of every place they've touched along the way. Our story begins in a place where time seems to stand still, where the air is so thin and cold that each breath feels like drinking liquid crystal. High in the mountains, far above the tree line, far above where most life as we know it can survive, something remarkable is happening. It's happening so slowly that you could watch for an entire lifetime and barely notice the change, yet it's one of the most powerful forces shaping our planet. Picture, if you will, the highest peaks of a mountain range. The wind here doesn't whistle through trees or rustle leaves because there are no trees, no leaves, nothing but stone and sky and the endless dance of weather. The temperature rarely rises above freezing, even in the height of summer, and for most of the year it's so cold that exposed skin would freeze in minutes. But even in this seemingly barren place, something beautiful is being born. Snow falls, as it has for thousands of years, settling into the protected valleys and sheltered slopes between the peaks. Layer upon layer, season after season, the snow accumulates. What makes this place special isn't just the cold, though that's certainly important. It's the persistence of that cold, the way winter never really ends here, the way each year's snowfall joins with the last, building something that will endure. You see, snow that never melts begins to change. It's a transformation so gradual, so patient, that it happens almost like a secret whispered from one century to the next. The weight of new snow pressing down on old snow begins to compress those lower layers, squeezing out the air, pressing the individual flakes closer and closer together until they're no longer recognizable as the delicate, unique crystals that once danced down from the clouds. This compressed snow has a name, this in-between stage of its transformation. Scientists call it firn, and it represents something like the adolescence of ice. No longer the fluffy, airy snow that children make snowballs from, but not yet the dense, ancient ice that will eventually flow like slow-motion rivers down the mountainsides. Firn is patient, waiting, accumulating more weight, more pressure, more time. The process continues year after year, decade after decade. The firn grows denser, the individual snow grains fusing together, becoming something more solid, more permanent. And then, after perhaps 50 years or more of this slow compression, something magical happens. The firn becomes glacial ice, dense and blue and ancient, containing within its frozen structure the memory of every snowstorm that contributed to its creation. But this ice isn't just sitting there, static and unchanging. No, it's alive in its own way, responding to forces we can barely comprehend. The sheer weight of all that accumulated ice, sometimes hundreds of feet thick, creates pressures that cause the glacier to behave in ways that seem almost impossible. Ice, which we think of as solid and immovable, begins to flow. It flows like honey, like thick syrup, following the contours of the land beneath it, carving valleys, grinding away solid rock, reshaping the very bones of the mountains. This is where our river's story truly begins, not with liquid water, but with this slow-moving river of ice, this glacier that has been building and growing and gathering strength for centuries. Imagine standing at the edge of one of these glaciers, feeling the cold radiating from its surface, seeing the deep blue ice that speaks of incredible age and pressure. Within that ice are trapped bubbles of ancient air, little time capsules that contain the atmosphere from hundreds or even thousands of years ago. Scientists study these bubbles to understand what our planet's climate was like, long before anyone was keeping records, before anyone was even thinking about such things. The glacier moves, but so slowly that you could sit and watch it for hours and see no motion at all. Yet move it does, perhaps just a few feet each year, but inexorably, unstoppably, following the pull of gravity and the shape of the land beneath it. It's like watching geology in slow motion, seeing the earth itself being sculpted by the patient persistence of ice. As our ancient river of ice begins its patient journey down from the highest peaks, it enters into a relationship with the landscape that is both creative and destructive, both gentle and incredibly powerful. This is the slow dance of glaciers, a choreography that unfolds over millennia, reshaping entire mountain ranges and carving the valleys that will one day cradle the liquid waters of our river. The glacier doesn't flow smoothly, like water rushing down a hillside. Instead, it moves with the ponderous dignity of something incredibly ancient and massive. Deep within the ice, there are layers that tell stories, each one representing a different year, a different season, a different moment in the long history of snowfall and compression. Some layers are darker, filled with dust from volcanic eruptions or particles blown in from distant deserts. Others are crystal clear, formed during particularly pure snowfalls when the air was clean and still. As the glacier moves, it acts like a giant rasp, a file of unimaginable size and power, grinding against the bedrock beneath it. The ice picks up rocks, some as small as pebbles, others as large as houses, and carries them along like a slow-motion landslide. These rocks, frozen into the bottom and sides of the glacier, become tools of erosion, scraping and gouging the landscape as the ice flows over it. The valleys that glaciers carve have a distinctive shape, different from the sharp V-shaped valleys that liquid water creates. Glacial valleys are U-shaped, with wide, rounded bottoms and steep sides, sculpted by the massive bulk of ice that once filled them completely. When you see one of these valleys today, perhaps filled with a lake or crossed by a highway, you're looking at the signature of an ancient glacier, a geological autograph left behind by our slow-moving river of ice. But the glacier isn't just carving the landscape, it's also collecting stories. Every piece of rock it picks up, every grain of sediment it scrapes from the mountainsides, becomes part of its cargo, part of the material it will eventually deliver to the valleys below. This debris, known as glacial till, contains rocks from far up the mountainside, minerals and stones that would never naturally be found together, all mixed and tumbled by the patient work of the ice. The glacier has moods, of sorts, responding to changes in temperature and snowfall that occur over decades and centuries. During colder periods, it grows, advancing down the valley, claiming new territory, carving deeper into the bedrock. During warmer times, it retreats, leaving behind moraines, ridges of rock and debris that mark its former extent like the rings of a tree marking its age. At the front of the glacier, something remarkable happens. This is where our story begins to transition from ice to water, where the solid becomes liquid, where the patient, slow-moving glacier begins to release the water it has held prisoner for decades or even centuries. The terminus of the glacier, as scientists call this front edge, is a place of constant, subtle drama. Here, the ancient ice finally encounters temperatures warm enough to overcome its frozen state. The melting doesn't happen all at once, like an ice cube dropped into warm water. Instead, it's a gradual process, a slow surrender to the changing conditions. Water begins to appear, first as tiny trickles, then as small streams, emerging from beneath the glacier like secrets finally being whispered. This meltwater carries with it the story of its journey. It's cloudy with glacial flour, the incredibly fine particles of rock that have been ground by the glacier's movement, so fine they remain suspended in the water, giving it a distinctive milky appearance. This isn't the clear water we might expect, but rather water that tells the story of mountains being slowly worn away, of bedrock being patiently ground into powder. The temperature of this newborn water is just barely above freezing, carrying with it the chill of centuries. It moves with a different energy than the glacier from which it came, no longer bound by the slow rules of ice, suddenly free to respond to gravity in a more immediate way. Yet, it still carries the patience of its glacial origins, the steady persistence that will characterize our river throughout its long journey to the sea. There is something almost magical about that first moment when ice becomes water, when something that has been solid and still for decades suddenly gains the freedom to flow. If we could somehow witness this transformation at the molecular level, we would see water molecules breaking free from the rigid crystal structure that has held them in place for so long, suddenly able to move and dance and respond to the pull of gravity. Our first drop of river water emerges from the glacier tentatively, part of a tiny trickle that might be missed if you weren't looking carefully. It carries with it the essence of ancient snowfalls, the memory of winter storms that raged when our grandparents' grandparents were young. This single drop has been on a journey of compression and patience, slowly making its way through the glacier like a passenger on the world's slowest train. But now, suddenly, everything changes. The drop finds itself part of a small stream, no longer alone but joining with other newly melted companions. Together they begin the next phase of their journey, leaving behind the realm of ice and entering the world of flowing water. The stream they form is tiny at first, perhaps no wider than your hand, shallow enough to step across without getting your ankles wet. Yet even this small stream has power. It begins immediately to shape its environment, cutting a small channel in the loose debris left behind by the glacier. The water is still, incredibly cold, just a degree or two above freezing, but it moves with an energy that seems almost eager after the patient stillness of ice. It gurgles and whispers as it flows, the first voice our river has ever had. The landscape through which our newborn stream flows is harsh and seemingly lifeless. This is the recently deglaciated terrain, ground that was until recently covered by hundreds of feet of ice. The soil here is thin, if it exists at all, mostly just bare rock and glacial debris. Yet even in this austere environment, life finds a way to take hold. Tiny plants, specially adapted to these extreme conditions, begin to colonize the area. Alpine forget-me-nots push up through cracks in the rock, their small blue flowers providing the first splashes of colour in this monochrome landscape. Cushion plants spread slowly across exposed surfaces, building soil grain by grain, creating tiny oases of life in what was recently a frozen desert. Our stream begins to collect tributaries, other small meltwater streams emerging from different parts of the glacier, or from patches of snow that persist in sheltered areas. Each confluence, no matter how small, changes the character of our growing waterway. More water means more power to carve, more ability to transport sediment, more complexity in the way the water moves and sounds. The water's journey is not smooth or predictable. The terrain it flows through is rough and chaotic, full of obstacles left behind by the retreating glacier. Boulders the size of cars sit scattered across the landscape like ancient sculptures. The stream must find its way around these obstacles, sometimes splitting into multiple channels, sometimes pooling behind natural dams of rock and debris before finding a way through. With each obstacle overcome, our stream grows more confident, more accomplished at the art of flow. It learns the physics of water in motion, discovering how to move around corners, how to speed up in narrow sections and slow down where the channel widens. These are lessons that will serve our river well in the longer journey ahead. The water temperature begins to warm ever so slightly as it flows away from its icy source. Not much, perhaps just a degree or two, but enough to begin the first subtle changes in the stream's ecology. Microscopic life forms, bacteria and algae, adapted to cold conditions, begin to colonize the stream bed, forming the very bottom of what will eventually become a complex aquatic food web. As our stream gains momentum and size, it begins to carry more than just water and glacial flour. Small pebbles start to move along the stream bed, rolled along by the current in a process called saltation. These pebbles tumble downstream, their rough edges slowly being worn smooth by constant contact with the stream bed and with each other. They're beginning their own long journey toward the sea, though they travel much more slowly than the water that carries them. As our young stream continues, its descent from the glacial heights, something wonderful begins to happen. What started as a tentative trickle of meltwater has grown into something more substantial, more confident in its purpose. The stream now has a voice, a gentle murmur that speaks of water finding its way, of persistence overcoming obstacles, of the ancient pull of gravity guiding our river toward its destiny. The landscape through which our stream flows is beginning to change as well. We're moving away from the harsh, recently glaciated terrain and entering areas that have been ice-free for longer, places where life has had more time to establish itself. The changes are subtle at first, but they speak of a world awakening to the presence of flowing water. Mosses begin to appear along the stream banks, soft green cushions that capture and hold moisture, creating tiny micro-environments where other plants can take root. These mosses are pioneers, the first to recognize the opportunity that flowing water represents. They don't need soil in the traditional sense, instead growing directly on rock surfaces, slowly breaking down the stone through chemical processes that will, over time, create the soil that future plants will need. The stream itself is learning as it flows. It's discovering the principles of hydraulics through direct experience, finding the most efficient path through the landscape, creating pools where the gradient flattens and rushing rapids where the slope steepens. Each bend, each pool, each riffle represents a solution to the problem of how water moves through space, following laws of physics that were ancient before the first humans walked the earth. In the pools, something remarkable begins to happen. The water slows down, and heavier particles in the glacial flour begin to settle out, creating small deposits of fine sediment on the stream bottom. These sediments are rich with minerals ground from the mountains above, containing all the elements that plants need to grow. Over time, these deposits will become the fertile soils of the valley below, carrying the mountain's wealth down to places where it can support abundant life. The water's temperature continues to warm as it flows away from its glacial source and as it absorbs heat from the sun and the surrounding landscape. This warming, though still modest, begins to unlock new possibilities for life. Certain species of algae that couldn't survive in the near-freezing temperatures closer to the glacier begin to appear, adding the first hints of green to the stream's ecosystem. Our stream begins to encounter its first true tributaries, other waterways that have their own stories, their own sources. Some of these tributaries come from snowfields that persist in sheltered valleys, others from small springs where groundwater emerges from deep within the mountain. Each tributary brings its own character to our growing river, its own temperature, its own mineral content, its own microscopic passengers. The Confluence of streams is never just about water joining water. It's about ecosystems merging, about different water chemistries mixing, about the mathematical elegance of flow dynamics as two currents become one. At each confluence, our river becomes something new, something more complex and capable than either of its contributing streams could be alone. As the stream grows larger and more substantial, it begins to develop a rhythm, a pattern of behavior that will characterize our river throughout much of its journey. During the day, when the sun warms the glacier and surrounding snowfields, the flow increases as more ice melts. During the night, when temperatures drop, the flow diminishes. This daily cycle gives our river a pulse, a heartbeat that connects it to the rhythms of the sun and the seasons. The first insects begin to appear, tiny creatures that have found ways to thrive in the harsh conditions of high mountain streams. These are often the larvae of midges and other flies, creatures that can tolerate the cold water and the limited food sources available. They graze on the thin films of algae that coat the streambed rocks, beginning the process of energy transfer that will eventually support more complex ecosystems downstream. Our stream is also beginning to transport significant amounts of sediment now, not just the fine glacial flour from its source, but also materials picked up along its journey. Sand grains, small pebbles, bits of organic matter from the sparse vegetation along its banks, all become part of the stream's cargo, materials that our river will carry toward the sea, redistributing the substance of the mountains across the landscape below. The sound of our stream changes as it grows. What started as a gentle whisper has become a more confident murmur, punctuated by the splash and gurgle of water moving over rocks, the subtle percussion of pebbles rolling along the stream bed, the hollow sound of water falling into deeper pools. This is the voice of our river finding itself, discovering its power and purpose. As we follow our stream down from its glacial birthplace, we can see that we're witnessing something that has repeated countless times throughout Earth's history, yet is also unique to this particular moment, this particular combination of geology and climate and circumstance. Every river has its own story, its own personality shaped by the landscape through which it flows, yet all rivers share this common beginning, this transition from ice to water, from stillness to flow, from potential to kinetic energy. Our young river carries within its waters the promise of all that is to come, the potential for the lush valleys and rich deltas that lie ahead in its journey. But for now, it remains focused on the immediate challenges, learning the lessons of flow, gathering strength and substance, preparing for the longer journey that awaits below. As our newborn river takes its very first steps away from the glacier that gave it life, something magical begins to happen. Picture, if you will, a child taking those tentative first steps across a room, uncertain but filled with an innate understanding of where it needs to go. This is exactly what our river does as it begins its descent from the high mountain peaks, following the ancient pull of gravity that has guided water for millions and millions of years. The path ahead is not an easy one, and our young river seems to understand this instinctively. The mountain slopes are steep and unforgiving, covered in loose rocks, boulders that have tumbled from even higher peaks, and patches of hardy alpine vegetation that have learned to survive in this harsh, beautiful environment. The air up here is thin and crisp, so pure that each breath feels like drinking liquid crystal, and the temperature can swing from pleasantly warm in the sunshine to bone-chillingly cold when clouds pass over the sun. Our river begins as just a tiny trickle, no wider than your thumb, but already it carries within it the memory of ancient ice and the promise of the vast ocean that waits thousands of miles away. As it moves down the mountain, it follows the path of least resistance, finding the smallest cracks and crevices in the rock, the gentle depressions that guide it ever downward. Sometimes it disappears entirely beneath a pile of rocks, only to emerge again a few feet later, sparkling in the sunlight like liquid diamonds. The sound it makes is barely a whisper at first, just the softest gurgling as it moves over and around the smallest pebbles. But even this gentle sound carries with it something profound, something that speaks to the very essence of movement and change. This is the sound of transformation, the quiet music that plays as our river begins to shape not just its own destiny, but the landscape around it. As the hours pass and our river continues its descent, something wonderful begins to happen. The tiny trickle starts to encounter other small streams, other children of the same glacier, or perhaps offspring of nearby snowfields that have also begun their journey toward the sea. When two of these small streams meet, there's always a moment of hesitation, as if they're greeting each other, sharing stories of their brief but already eventful journeys down the mountainside. Then, with a gentle joining that seems almost ceremonial, they become one. The combined stream is noticeably larger now, perhaps twice the width it was before, and the sound changes too. The whisper becomes a gentle murmur, still soft and soothing, but with more presence, more authority. This is the river learning one of its most important lessons, that it will grow stronger not just through its own journey, but by welcoming others who share its path. The rocks that line the riverbed at this elevation are fascinating in their diversity. Some are massive granite boulders, ancient and weathered, that have been sitting in place since the mountains themselves were young. These giants have seen countless streams flow past them, and they wear the marks of that passage in the smooth, polished surfaces where the water has caressed them year after year. Other rocks are smaller, more recent arrivals that have broken away from cliff faces during harsh winter freezes or spring thaws. Our river treats each rock differently, learning as it goes. Around the massive boulders, it flows with respect and patience, finding the narrow channels and gaps that allow passage. With the smaller rocks, it's more playful, sometimes nudging them along, gradually moving them downstream to new positions. This is the river's first lesson in the art of persistence, that even the mightiest obstacles can be overcome, not through force, but through patience and the gentle, consistent application of effort over time. As our river continues its descent through the alpine meadows and past the tree line, it begins to discover that it's not alone in this vast mountain wilderness. Everywhere it looks, there are other streams, other young rivers, all born from the same high mountain sources, all following their own unique paths down toward the valleys below. Some are rushing and energetic, tumbling over rocks in a series of tiny waterfalls that catch the sunlight and throw it back in prismatic sprays of colour. Others are more contemplative, taking their time, meandering through softer ground where wildflowers bloom in impossible profusion during the brief mountain summer. The community of streams that exists in these high mountains is truly something to behold. Each stream has its own personality, its own rhythm and pace, its own way of negotiating the challenges that the mountain presents. Some streams are bold and confident, carving straight paths down steep slopes with a determination that's almost inspiring to watch. Others are more thoughtful, taking circuitous routes that wind back and forth across the mountainside, as if they're in no hurry to leave this beautiful high country. When streams meet in these mountain meadows, the joining is often accompanied by a small celebration of sorts. The water seems to dance and sparkle more brightly at these confluence points, creating small pools where the currents swirl together in gentle eddies. These pools become gathering places for the mountain wildlife that depends on the streams for survival. Tiny alpine butterflies come to drink, their delicate wings catching the light like stained glass windows. Small mountain birds bathe in the shallow edges, sending up sprays of crystal droplets that create momentary rainbows in the bright mountain air. The vegetation around these stream communities is particularly lush and vibrant. The constant source of fresh, cold water creates microclimates that support an incredible diversity of plant life. Cushions of moss grow in the splash zones where the streams tumble over rocks, creating soft green carpets that seem to glow with an inner light. Delicate mountain flowers, forget-me-nots, alpine asters, and tiny wild roses bloom in abundance, their colours made even more vivid by the clean mountain air and intense ultraviolet light of high altitude.
Our river learns important lessons from each stream it encounters. From the bold, fast-moving streams, it learns about momentum and the power of decisive action. From the meandering, contemplative streams, it learns about patience and the value of taking time to explore all possibilities. From the streams that have carved deep, narrow channels through solid rock, it learns about focus and persistence. From those that have spread wide across meadows, creating wetlands and boggy areas, it learns about the value of slowing down and nurturing the life around it. As these stream communities grow larger and more complex, they begin to create their own weather patterns. The movement of water through the landscape creates localized humidity, which in turn affects cloud formation and precipitation patterns. On calm evenings, when the air is still and clear, you can actually see the streams breathing, releasing gentle wisps of water vapor that rise up from the water's surface and dissipate into the crystalline air. The temperature of the water in these high mountain streams is remarkably consistent, staying cold throughout the day and night due to the recent snowmelt and glacial origins. This cold water holds more dissolved oxygen than warmer water would, making it incredibly pure and life-giving. Fish that live in these streams, small mountain trout, with their jewel-bright colors and incredibly pure flavor, have adapted to thrive in this oxygen-rich environment, developing efficient metabolisms that allow them to survive in water that would be too cold for their lowland cousins. As our river grows stronger through its union with other streams, it begins to take on one of its most important and transformative roles, that of sculptor and architect of the landscape itself. This is where the river's story becomes truly extraordinary, because here we witness the incredible power of persistence and time working together to create some of the most beautiful features on our planet. The process begins almost imperceptibly. Our river, now perhaps the width of a small sidewalk and flowing with the combined strength of dozens of smaller streams, encounters its first significant rock formation. This might be a ridge of particularly hard granite that extends across the valley floor, or perhaps a section where softer sedimentary rock lies beneath harder layers above. At first glance, it would seem impossible that something as gentle as flowing water could have any effect on solid rock. But our river carries with it a secret weapon. Time, hour by hour, day by day, year by year, the river flows over and around these rock formations, carrying with it tiny particles of sand and grit that act like the finest sandpaper. These particles themselves, the products of erosion from higher up the mountain, become tools in the river's patient work of carving and shaping. The process is so gradual that you could sit and watch for an entire day and see no visible change. But over decades and centuries, the transformation is profound. The first small valley that our river carves is a marvel of natural engineering. The riverbed becomes slightly deeper, creating a channel that guides the water more efficiently downhill. The banks on either side begin to take shape, defined by the river's seasonal variations in flow. During spring snowmelt, when the river runs high and fast, it carves the upper edges of its banks. During drier periods, when the flow is gentler, it works on the deeper sections of its bed, gradually wearing away the rock beneath. What's truly fascinating about this process is how the river seems to know exactly where to go, following the principles of physics that govern fluid dynamics. It naturally finds the path that allows it to move the most water with the least resistance. This means following the natural contours of the land, seeking out the places where the rock is softer or where existing cracks and fissures provide pathways through harder formations. As the valley deepens and takes shape, it begins to create its own microclimate. The walls of the valley provide shelter from the harsh mountain winds, creating a slightly warmer, more protected environment than the exposed slopes above. This protected space becomes a haven for plants and animals that might not be able to survive in the harsher conditions of the open mountainside. Tall grasses begin to grow along the riverbanks, their roots helping to stabilize the soil and prevent erosion. Wildflowers bloom in the protected spots, where snow melts early and stays away late in the season. The sound of the river changes as it flows through its newly carved valley. The walls of rock on either side create a natural amphitheater that amplifies and enriches the sound of flowing water. What was once a simple murmur becomes a more complex symphony, with deeper bass notes where the water flows over larger rocks and higher crystalline tones where it ripples over gravel beds. This music of the river becomes one of the defining characteristics of the valley, a constant, soothing soundtrack that plays day and night. Throughout the seasons, wildlife begins to discover and colonize this new valley environment. Mountain goats and bighorn sheep find that the valley provides not only water but also protection from predators and harsh weather. Birds discover that the valley creates updrafts and wind patterns that make flying easier, and many species begin to use the valley as a migration corridor. Small mammals like pikas and marmots find that the valley's protected environment and abundant plant life make it an ideal place to establish territories and raise their young. The river itself benefits from the valley. It has created the defined channel allows it to flow more efficiently, reducing the energy lost to friction and allowing it to carry more sediment and carve even more effectively. This creates a positive feedback loop where the river's carving ability increases as the valley deepens, leading to faster and more dramatic landscape changes over geological timescales. That to truly understand and appreciate our river's journey, we need to take a moment to marvel at the incredible physics that govern how water behaves as it moves through the mountain landscape. These natural laws, discovered and described by scientists over centuries of careful observation, help explain why our river behaves the way it does, and why its journey is so perfectly orchestrated by the forces of nature. At the heart of everything is gravity, that fundamental force that pulls our river inexorably downward toward the sea. But gravity alone doesn't tell the whole story of how our river moves and behaves. The way water flows is governed by principles that are both elegantly simple and fascinatingly complex, creating patterns and behaviors that have inspired scientists, engineers, and poets alike. When our river flows down a steep mountain slope, it demonstrates the principle of potential energy being converted to kinetic energy. The water at the top of a slope has potential energy by virtue of its height above sea level. As it flows downward, this potential energy is converted to kinetic energy, the energy of motion. This is why mountain streams often flow so quickly and powerfully, carrying with them tremendous erosive force despite their relatively small size. But the river doesn't just race straight downhill. The way it moves is influenced by a complex interplay of forces including friction, turbulence, and the river's own momentum. Friction occurs where the water touches the riverbed and banks, slowing down the flow and creating drag. This is why water in the center of a stream typically flows faster than water near the edges. There's less friction in the middle, where the water isn't touching the sides. Turbulence is another fascinating aspect of our river's physics. When water flows over rocks or around obstacles, it creates swirls and eddies that help mix the water column and increase the river's ability to carry sediment and dissolved minerals. These turbulent patterns aren't random, they follow mathematical principles that create surprisingly consistent and predictable flow patterns. The spirals and vortices that form in turbulent water follow the same mathematical relationships that describe galaxies, weather systems, and many other natural phenomena. The temperature of the water plays a crucial role in how our river behaves. Cold mountain water is denser than warm water, which affects how it flows and how much sediment it can carry. Cold water also holds more dissolved oxygen, making it more capable of supporting aquatic life. The seasonal temperature variations of our river create different flow characteristics throughout the year, with spring snowmelt creating powerful sediment-laden floods that can dramatically reshape the riverbed in just a few days. One of the most beautiful physics phenomena our river demonstrates is the way it transports energy through wave motion. When you watch water flowing over rocks, you're seeing energy waves traveling downstream, carrying momentum and force, even when individual water molecules are following much more complex, swirling paths. These energy waves are what give flowing water its hypnotic, rhythmic quality that has such a calming effect on human observers. The river also demonstrates principles of fluid mechanics in the way it carves its channel. The spiral flow patterns that develop in river bends, known as helical flow, create a natural sorting mechanism that helps the river organize sediment by size and weight. Heavier particles tend to settle in certain areas, while lighter materials are carried further downstream. This natural sorting process is what creates the distinctive patterns of gravel, sand, and fine silt that characterize different sections of a river system. Surface tension, the property that allows water molecules to stick together, plays an important role in how our river interacts with rocks and vegetation. This molecular attraction creates the meniscus effect you can see where water meets rock surfaces, and it helps explain how water can seem to climb up smooth rock faces in defiance of gravity. Surface tension also contributes to the formation of water droplets in spray and mist, creating the beautiful visual effects that make waterfalls and rapids so captivating to watch. The river's ability to dissolve and transport minerals demonstrates the chemical properties of water that make it such a powerful geological agent. Pure water is actually a mild acid, and as it flows over rock, it gradually dissolves minerals and carries them downstream. This process, happening molecule by molecule, over vast periods of time, is what allows rivers to carve through solid rock and create spectacular canyons and gorges. The dissolved minerals also make the water slightly more conductive of electricity, which is why flowing water creates small electrical fields that some fish and other aquatic animals can sense and use for navigation. One of the most remarkable aspects of our river's story is how it changes and adapts with the seasons, following ancient rhythms that have governed mountain waterways for millions of years. These seasonal variations create a dynamic, ever-changing personality for our river, transforming it from a gentle, contemplative stream in late summer to a powerful, rushing torrent during spring snowmelt, and even to a quiet, ice-bordered whisper during the depths of winter. Spring comes to the mountains with dramatic flair, and our river responds with equally dramatic changes. As temperatures rise and daylight hours lengthen, something magical begins to happen throughout. The watershed, snow that has accumulated over months of winter storms, begins to melt, starting first on the sun-facing slopes and gradually spreading to shadier areas and higher elevations. This isn't a gradual, gentle process. Spring snowmelt is one of nature's most powerful and transformative events. Our river, which may have spent the winter as a modest stream barely a few feet wide, suddenly finds itself swollen with an incredible volume of fresh water. The snow melt arrives in waves, with warm, sunny days creating massive pulses of runoff that can increase the river's flow by 10 or even 20 times its winter levels. The river that was once a gentle murmur becomes a roaring torrent, its voice completely transformed as it carries the accumulated water of an entire winter's worth of precipitation down toward the valleys below. This spring flood season is when our river does much of its most dramatic landscape shaping work. The massive volume of fast-moving water carries tremendous erosive power, capable of moving boulders the size of automobiles and carving new channels through areas that seemed permanently established. Riverbanks that took decades to develop can be reshaped in a matter of hours as the flood stage river seeks new pathways to accommodate its increased flow. The water during spring runoff is often milky or muddy in appearance, colored by the tremendous load of sediment, sand, silt, and tiny rock particles that the river carries downstream. This sediment load is actually one of the river's most important tools for carving and shaping the landscape. The suspended particles act like liquid sandpaper, gradually wearing away rock surfaces and allowing the water to carve deeper into its bed. Summer brings a different character to our river's personality. As the most accessible snow melts away and temperatures stabilize, the river settles into a more consistent, predictable flow pattern. The water runs clearer now, with less sediment load, allowing sunlight to penetrate deeper into the stream and support more diverse aquatic plant life. This is the season when the river becomes most hospitable to fish and other aquatic animals. With warmer temperatures, stable flows, and abundant food sources creating ideal conditions for reproduction and growth. The summer river is also when most human visitors get to experience its beauty and tranquility. The stable, predictable flows make it safe for recreation, while the clear, clean water showcases the incredible beauty of the mountain stream environment. This is when you can truly appreciate the intricate patterns of light and shadow playing on the riverbed, the way the current creates constantly shifting patterns of ripples and waves on the surface, and the incredible diversity of plant and animal life that depends on the river for survival. As autumn arrives in the mountains, our river undergoes another transformation. The reduced daylight and cooling temperatures mean less snowmelt and more stable flows, but autumn brings its own unique characteristics to the river's story. This is the season when deciduous trees and shrubs along the riverbanks put on their spectacular display of four colors, creating a mirror-like reflection in the calm water that doubles the visual impact of the changing leaves. Autumn is also when many of the river's fish species begin their spawning activities, adding another layer of life and activity to the river ecosystem. The clear, cold water and stable flows provide perfect conditions for fish to build their nests, or redds, in the gravel beds of the river. Watching salmon, trout, and other fish species navigate the shallow waters of autumn streams is like witnessing one of nature's most ancient and essential ceremonies. Winter transforms our river into something almost magical. As temperatures drop well below freezing, ice begins to form along the edges of the stream, creating delicate crystalline borders that frame the still-flowing water in the center. The contrast between the moving water and the static ice creates visual patterns that are constantly changing as the ice melts and reforms with daily temperature fluctuations in the depths of winter. Sections of our river may freeze completely, creating temporary dams that redirect the flow into underground channels, or cause the water to back up and create temporary ponds and wetlands. These winter ice dams are part of the river's natural cycle, creating habitat diversity and helping to regulate the flow of water throughout the season. When spring returns and the ice melts, these temporary dams release their stored water in dramatic pulses that help initiate the spring flood cycle throughout all these seasonal changes. Our river maintains its essential character and purpose, but each season brings out different aspects of its personality. The seasonal rhythm of the river is like a great symphony, with themes and variations that repeat year after year, yet with enough variation and improvisation to keep the performance fresh and engaging for those who take the time to really listen and observe. As our river emerges from the steep mountain passages, something magical begins to happen. The angry rush of water that once thundered down rocky slopes starts to slow, starts to breathe, starts to relax into something altogether more peaceful. Picture, if you will, the river taking its first deep breath as it enters the wide embrace of a valley. Like a runner finally allowed to slow their pace after a long, exhausting sprint, the valley welcomes our river with open arms made of gentle, rolling hills that stretch away on both sides like a vast green carpet. Here, the landscape softens, the harsh edges of mountain stone giving way to something more forgiving, more nurturing. The river feels this change immediately, as if it has stepped from a crowded, noisy street into a quiet library where whispers carry further than shouts. In this valley sanctuary, our river begins to discover new aspects of its personality, where once it carved and crashed, now it begins to meander, to explore, to take time to notice the world around it. The water moves in gentle curves, creating what we call meanders, those beautiful serpentine bends that look like cursive writing across the landscape, as if the river is penning a love letter to the earth itself. These meanders aren't random wanderings, they're the river's way of finding the most efficient path while dealing with the gentler gradients of valley floors. When water slows down, it starts to deposit some of the sediment it has been carrying from the mountains. Like a traveler finally unpacking their heavy bags after a long journey, the river begins to drop its burden of sand, silt, and tiny pebbles along its banks. This is where we begin to see the river as a master architect, designing and redesigning the landscape with each passing season. During spring floods, when snow melt swells the river beyond its normal banks, it spreads out across the valley floor, depositing rich, fertile sediment in a process that has been happening for thousands of years. This creates what we call a floodplain, a flat, fertile area that becomes some of the most productive agricultural land on Earth. The relationship between our river and the valley it flows through is like a dance that has been choreographed over millennia. The river shapes the valley, carving its channel deeper and wider, while the valley shapes the river, guiding its path and moderating its flow. It's a partnership, a conversation between water and land that speaks in the language of erosion and deposition, of floods and dry seasons, of life and renewal. As the river winds through the valley, it begins to create what geologists call a river system, a network of channels, wetlands, and floodplains that support an incredible diversity of life. Along the banks, willows and cottonwoods stretch their roots deep into the moist soil, their branches creating cool, shaded corridors that provide habitat for countless species of birds, mammals, and insects. The valley ecosystem that develops around our river is like a grand theater where thousands of different species play their parts in an ongoing drama of survival, reproduction, and renewal. Kingfishers dive from overhanging branches to catch fish in the slower moving waters. Beavers, those master engineers of the animal kingdom, begin to take notice of our river, perhaps constructing their first dams in the quieter tributaries, creating ponds that serve as nurseries for fish and amphibians. The river's temperature begins to moderate in the valley environment. No longer chilled by contact with glacial ice and rocky mountain streams, the water warms slightly, becoming more hospitable to a wider variety of aquatic life. Fish species that couldn't survive in the turbulent, cold mountain reaches now find suitable habitat in the calmer valley waters. Trout still thrive in the cooler, oxygen-rich sections, while other species, like suckers and minnows, find niches in the warmer, slower-moving areas. But perhaps, most remarkably, this is where our river begins its first real encounters with human civilization. Valleys have always been magnets for human settlement, and for good reason. They provide flat land for agriculture, protection from harsh weather, and of course, access to fresh water, the most precious resource for any community in the heart of the valley. Our river performs one of its most generous acts, the annual gift of fertility to the land. Each spring, as winter snow melts in the distant mountains and spring rains swell the tributaries, our river rises from its banks like a gentle giant stretching after a long sleep. This isn't the violent, destructive flooding that we might fear, but rather a slow, deliberate spreading of water across the floodplain, a process as natural and essential as breathing. Imagine watching this transformation from high above, perhaps from a hawk's perspective as it soars over the valley. You would see the river expand from a narrow ribbon of blue into a vast sheet of water that covers the valley floor, creating temporary lakes and wetlands that shimmer in the spring sunlight. This is the river at its most generous, sharing not just its water but also its accumulated wealth of nutrients and sediments. The sediment that our river has been carrying, that fine mixture of ground-up mountains, organic matter and minerals, now settles onto the floodplain like a cosmic gift. This sediment is incredibly rich, containing all the nutrients that plants need to thrive. It's like the river has been shopping in the mountains all year, collecting the finest minerals and organic compounds, and now it's delivering them directly to the valley floor, free of charge. As the floodwaters gradually recede, they leave behind soil so fertile that it seems almost magical in its productivity. This is why river valleys have been the cradles of civilization throughout human history. The annual flood cycle creates soil that can support abundant crops with minimal human intervention. The Nile Valley, the Mesopotamian plains between the Tigris and Euphrates, the valleys of the Indus and the Yellow River, all of these became centers of human civilization precisely because of this generous gift that rivers provide. Our rivers. Flood cycle becomes the heartbeat of the valley ecosystem. Animals and plants have evolved to depend on this rhythm, timing their life cycles to take advantage of the river's generous nature. Migrating birds arrive just as the floods create new wetlands perfect for feeding and nesting. Seeds that have waited patiently in the soil germinate as soon as the nutrient-rich floodwaters touch them. Fish spawn in the shallow, warm waters of the temporary flood zones, giving their young protected nurseries in which to grow. The relationship between the river and the valley deepens with each passing year. The river doesn't just flow through the valley, it creates the valley, constantly reshaping and renewing the landscape. Over hundreds of years, the river's meandering path slowly shifts back and forth across the valley floor, like a giant snake slowly writhing in its sleep. This process, called lateral migration, ensures that over time, every part of the valley floor receives the river's fertilizing touch. The chemistry of the river itself changes as it moves through the valley. The slower flow allows more time for chemical reactions to occur. Minerals dissolve more completely into the water. Organic matter has time to decompose, releasing nutrients that support aquatic plant life. The river becomes less like a mountain torrent and more like a flowing garden, rich with life and possibilities. Aquatic plants begin to flourish in the calmer waters, long strands of water weeds that wave in the current like underwater prairies, providing food and shelter for fish and invertebrates. Algae bloom in the warmer, nutrient-rich water, forming the base of a complex food web. The river is no longer just moving water. It's become a living ecosystem, a community of countless organisms, all depending on each other for survival. The banks of the river become galleries of vegetation, with different plants thriving at different distances from the water's edge. Right at the waterline, you might find cattails and bulrushes, their roots extending into the water itself. A little further back, willows and alders create a green corridor along the riverbank. Beyond that, the floodplain might support vast grasslands or, in forested regions, groves of trees that can tolerate periodic flooding. It's here, in the fertile embrace of the valley, that our river first encounters the eyes of human witnesses. Long before cities or farms, long before bridges or mills, there were the first people who looked upon our river and saw not just water, but possibility, not just a natural feature, but a partner in survival. Picture these early humans, perhaps, members of a nomadic tribe following the seasonal migrations of animals. They crest a hill and look down into the valley, and there below them flows our river, a ribbon of life cutting through the green expanse of the floodplain. The sight must have seemed like a miracle: fresh water, fertile soil, abundant wildlife, and natural pathways for travel, all in one place. These first human witnesses understood something that we sometimes forget in our modern world: that rivers are not just sources of water, but creators of abundance. They saw how the annual floods brought not destruction, but renewal. They observed how wildlife gathered along the riverbanks, how plants grew more lushly near the water, how the soil in the floodplain was darker and richer than the soil on the surrounding hills. The relationship between humans and our river began gently, respectfully. Early peoples took what they needed: fish from the waters, clay from the banks for pottery, reeds for baskets and shelter. They learned to read the rivers' moods, to predict when it would flood and when it would be calm. They developed the first conservation practices, understanding that if they took too much, the river might not be able to provide for future generations. The river, in turn, began to shape human culture and society. Seasonal festivals developed around the flood cycles. Stories and myths grew up around the river's behavior, tales of river spirits and water gods that reflected the deep respect these early peoples felt for the force that sustained their lives. The river became not just a physical feature of their landscape, but a spiritual presence, a deity that demanded reverence and offered blessings in return. As generations passed and human settlements became more permanent, the relationship between people and the river deepened and grew more complex. The first simple fishing camps gave way to more substantial villages. People learned to work with the river's flood cycles, planting crops that could benefit from the annual inundation, building homes on slightly higher ground that would be safe from all but the most extreme floods. The river became a highway for these early communities, a natural path that connected distant settlements and allowed for trade and communication. Canoes carved from fallen trees carried goods and people up and down the waterway. Stories, ideas, technologies, and genes all flowed along the river corridor, creating the first networks of human civilization. But it wasn't just what the river provided that shaped human development, it was also what the river taught. Living with a river requires patience, observation, and adaptation. You can't force a river to behave the way you want it to. You have to learn to work with its natural patterns. This relationship taught early humans some of their first lessons in cooperation, planning, and sustainable resource management. The river also served as a natural calendar for these early societies. The annual flood cycle provided a reliable way to mark the passage of time and plan agricultural activities. When the river began to rise, it was time to move to higher ground and prepare for planting. When it receded, it was time to sow seeds. In the newly fertilized soil, when it reached its lowest point, it was time to harvest and prepare for winter. The predictability of the river's behavior allowed human societies to develop agriculture, which in turn allowed for population growth and the development of more complex social structures. The surplus food produced by river valley agriculture freed some people from the daily task of food gathering, allowing them to become specialists, potters, toolmakers, storytellers, leaders. This specialization was one of the key steps in the development of human civilization. As our river continues its journey through the valley, it begins to show us another side of its personality. The river as a patient teacher, slowly and gently reshaping not just the land, but the very understanding of time itself. Here in the valley, changes happen on a different scale than in the mountains. Where mountain streams carve and crash with dramatic urgency, valley rivers work with the slow, steady persistence of a master craftsman. The river's meanders become more pronounced as it settles into its valley home. These beautiful curves and loops aren't just pretty to look at. They're the river's way of dissipating energy efficiently, like a child running down a steep hill who begins to zigzag to avoid falling. The river uses meanders to slow itself down and spread its energy across a wider area. Each curve represents thousands of years of patient adjustment. The river constantly fine-tuning its path to achieve the perfect balance between flow and friction. Over time, some of these meanders become so pronounced that they almost complete full circles. The river seems to be embracing itself, creating what geologists call oxbow lakes when the river finally cuts through the narrow neck of land at the base of a meander loop. These crescents of still water become unique ecosystems in their own right, gradually filling with sediment and vegetation, creating wetlands that serve as nurseries for wildlife and filters for water quality. The river's work as a landscape architect becomes increasingly sophisticated in the valley environment. It doesn't just carve a single channel, it creates a complex system of channels, backwaters, sloughs, and wetlands. During high water periods, the river spreads out into these secondary channels, creating a braided network that looks from above, like an intricate piece of lacework spread across the valley floor. This complexity serves multiple purposes. It provides habitat diversity for different species with different needs. Fast-flowing main channels support species that need well-oxygenated water and strong currents. Quiet backwaters provide nursery areas for young fish and habitat for species that prefer still water. Seasonal wetlands support migrating waterfowl and serve as breeding grounds for amphibians. The river's influence extends far beyond its visible banks. The water table in the valley is closely connected to the river level, creating a zone of influence that can extend for miles on either side of the main channel. Trees and other vegetation throughout this zone depend on groundwater that is ultimately supplied by the river. During dry periods, this stored groundwater slowly seeps back into the river, helping to maintain flow even when surface water is scarce. This hidden hydraulic relationship creates what hydrologists call the hyperhic zone, the area where surface water and groundwater mix and exchange. It's like a vast underground river system that parallels the surface river, creating a three-dimensional water ecosystem that supports life both above and below ground. The chemistry and biology of this zone are incredibly complex, with microorganisms, fungi, and small invertebrates creating intricate food webs in the spaces between grains of sediment. The seasonal rhythms of the river become more pronounced and predictable in the valley environment. Spring floods arrive with clockwork regularity, following the snowmelt patterns in the distant mountains. Summer low flows create concentrated pools where fish gather and aquatic plants flourish. Autumn brings moderate flows that allow for seed dispersal and animal migration. Winter often brings ice, which creates its own unique ecosystem dynamics. The ice season reveals another aspect of the river's character. When temperatures drop below freezing, the river doesn't simply stop flowing. It develops a complex relationship with ice that can create some of the most beautiful and dynamic scenes in nature. Ice forms first at the edges and in the quieter backwaters, gradually extending toward the center of the channel. But underneath this icy lid, the river continues to flow, creating a hidden world of liquid water beneath a crystal ceiling. This ice cover transforms the river ecosystem in remarkable ways. The ice acts as insulation, keeping the water temperature relatively stable even when air temperatures plummet. Fish and other aquatic life can survive the winter in this protected environment. At the same time, the ice prevents gas exchange with the atmosphere, creating unique chemical conditions that some species have evolved to exploit. When spring arrives and the ice begins to break up, the river puts on one of nature's most dramatic performances. Ice jams can create temporary dams that cause flooding, while ice floes grinding against each other create sounds that can be heard for miles. The mechanical force of moving ice can reshape riverbanks and scour the riverbed, contributing to the river's ongoing work as a landscape sculptor. As our river matures in its valley home, it begins to attract a more diverse and permanent human community. What started as seasonal hunting and fishing camps gradually evolves into year-round settlements, and then into something more complex, the first true river towns. These early settlements develop organically around the river's gifts and demands. Houses are built on natural levees, the slightly higher ground created by centuries of flood deposits right along the riverbank. These elevated areas provide protection from all but the most extreme floods, while still allowing easy access to the water. The architecture reflects the relationship with the river. Houses are often built on stilts or have raised first floors, with steep roofs that can shed heavy rains quickly. The river becomes the beating heart of these communities, providing not just water for drinking and cooking, but power for the first simple machines. Water wheels begin to appear along the riverbank, their slow, steady rotation grinding grain, powering simple mills, and driving the first mechanical devices. The sound of turning water wheels becomes the soundtrack of human progress, a gentle rhythm that matches the patient persistence of the river itself. Trade begins to flow along the river like a second current. Boats become more sophisticated, evolving from simple dugout canoes to crafted vessels designed for specific purposes, fishing boats with low profiles and stable hulls, cargo boats with large carrying capacity, passenger vessels designed for comfort during long journeys. The river becomes a highway that connects these valley communities to the outside world, allowing for the exchange of goods, ideas, and cultures. The skills required for river navigation become highly valued in these communities. River pilots, who can read the water, understand the seasonal changes in flow and channel patterns, and navigate safely through floods and low water periods, become essential members of society. They develop their own culture and traditions, passing down knowledge of the river through apprenticeship and storytelling. Markets develop at strategic points along the river, places where tributary streams join the main flow, where natural fords make crossing easier, or where the river makes a particularly sharp bend that creates a natural harbor. These market towns become nodes of activity, drawing people and goods from throughout the valley and beyond. The river's role as a transportation corridor makes these settlements natural centers of commerce and culture. The relationship between the human community and the river deepens with each generation. Local cultures develop their own river-specific traditions, festivals, and practices. Children grow up learning to swim in the river's waters, to fish from its banks, to read its moods and predict its behavior. The river becomes part of their identity, shaping their understanding of home, community, and the natural world. Religious and spiritual practices often develop around the river as well. It's seen as a source of purification and renewal, a place where important ceremonies are conducted. Baptisms, blessing ceremonies, and seasonal festivals all take place on the riverbank or in the water itself. The river becomes sacred space, a place where the human and natural worlds intersect most powerfully. Agriculture becomes more sophisticated as farmers learn to work with the river's flood cycles. They develop crops that can benefit from periodic flooding, and they learn to predict and prepare for the annual inundation. Irrigation systems begin to appear, simple at first, but gradually becoming more complex as communities learn to channel and control water flow for agricultural purposes. The river also serves as a natural boundary and meeting place between different communities. Treaties are often signed on riverbanks, with the river serving as a neutral witness to human agreements. The flowing water becomes a symbol of the passage of time and the permanence of commitments made in its presence. Conflict sometimes arises over river resources, fishing rights, water access, flood control responsibilities. But the river often serves as a mediator in these disputes as well. Its floods don't respect human boundaries, requiring cooperation for flood control. Its fish don't recognize property lines, encouraging sustainable management practices that benefit everyone. Its seasonal cycles require long-term thinking that encourages communities to work together for mutual benefit. As these river communities grow and prosper, they begin to leave their own mark on the river landscape. The first permanent structures, bridges, dams, canals begin to appear. These represent a shift in the human-river relationship from one of adaptation to one of active management. But the wise communities learn to work with the river's natural patterns rather than against them, creating infrastructure that enhances rather than fights the river's natural behavior. In the quiet moments between seasons, when the river flows at its most gentle and contemplative pace, it becomes clear that our river is not just a physical force shaping the landscape, but a profound teacher offering lessons about patience, persistence, and the power of gradual change. The communities that have grown up along its banks begin to understand that the river's greatest gift is not just its water or its fertile soil, but the wisdom it embodies. The river teaches through example rather than instruction. It shows how consistent, gentle pressure applied over time can accomplish what violent force cannot. The massive boulders that once blocked mountain streams are gradually worn smooth and eventually ground to sand. The hardest bedrock slowly yields to the patient caress of flowing water. Cliffs are undercut and collapse, canyons are carved, and entire landscapes are reshaped through the simple act of water moving downhill. This lesson in the power of persistence becomes deeply embedded in the culture of river communities. They learn to take the long view, to think in terms of generations rather than seasons. Building projects are planned with the understanding that they must work with the river's natural patterns, not against them. Agricultural practices develop that take advantage of the river's gifts while respecting its needs. Social structures emerge that can survive the inevitable floods and droughts that are part of the river's natural cycle. The river also teaches lessons about adaptation and resilience. Communities that thrive along the river are those that learn to bend without breaking, to adjust their practices and expectations based on the river's changing moods. They develop flexible agricultural systems that can handle both flood years and drought years. They build homes and businesses that can weather the occasional extreme flood while still taking advantage of the river's many benefits. Perhaps most importantly, the river teaches about interconnectedness. Nothing that happens in the river system exists in isolation. A change in forest cover in the distant mountains affects flood patterns in the valley. Agricultural practices on the floodplain influence water quality downstream. The health of fish populations depends on the quality of spawning habitats in tributary streams. Human activities in one part of the watershed have consequences throughout the entire system. This understanding of interconnectedness leads to some of humanity's first experiments in environmental management. River communities learn that they must consider the health of the entire watershed, not just their immediate stretch of river. They develop practices for managing forests, controlling erosion, and maintaining water quality that benefit the entire river system. These early conservation efforts represent some of the first examples of humans taking responsibility for environmental stewardship. The river's role as teacher extends to the most practical aspects of daily life. Children learn basic principles of physics by watching the river flow, how objects float or sink, how currents work, how energy is transferred from moving water to water wheels and mills. They learn biology by observing the incredible diversity of life that the river supports. They learn chemistry by watching how different substances dissolve in water or how sediments settle out of solution. The seasonal cycles of the river become a living laboratory for understanding natural processes. The annual flood cycle teaches lessons about erosion and deposition, about the transport of nutrients and sediments, about the relationships between weather patterns and water flow. The ice season demonstrates the physical properties of water and the effects of temperature change. The summer low-flow period reveals the importance of groundwater and the hidden connections between surface water and subsurface flow. River communities also learn important lessons about cooperation and collective action, managing flood control, maintaining navigation channels, and protecting water quality all require coordinated efforts that transcend individual property boundaries. The river teaches that some challenges can only be addressed through community action, and that the benefits of cooperation often extend far beyond the immediate problem being solved. The river's influence on human creativity becomes evident in the arts and literature that emerge from river communities. The flowing water inspires music that captures its rhythm and mood. Poetry develops that uses the river as a metaphor for life, time, and change. Visual arts flourish as artists attempt to capture the beauty and power of flowing water and the landscapes it creates. Storytelling traditions develop around the river as well. Tales are told of great floods and droughts, of heroic rescues and dramatic adventures on the water. These stories serve not just as entertainment, but as repositories of practical knowledge about river behavior and community history. They preserve lessons learned through experience and pass them on to future generations. The river also serves as a metaphor for understanding larger concepts about life and society. Its constant flow becomes a symbol for the passage of time and the inevitability of change. Its ability to carve through rock becomes a metaphor for persistence and determination. Its role in connecting distant places becomes a symbol for communication and unity. As our river prepares to leave the valley and continue its journey toward the sea, it carries with it not just water and sediment, but the accumulated wisdom and experience of all the communities it has touched. The lessons it has taught will influence human civilization for generations to come, even as the river itself continues to change and evolve. The relationship between humans and rivers, first formed in these valley communities, will become one of the defining features of human civilization as it spreads across the globe, as our river flows through the gentle valleys and rolling hills. Something remarkable begins to happen. The landscape around the water starts to change in ways that speak of intelligence, of planning, of hands that have learned to work with the river rather than against it. For thousands of years, the river has been carving its path through the earth, but now it encounters something new: the presence of human civilization, drawn to its banks like moths to a flame dot picture, if you will. The first moment when early humans discovered this particular stretch of river, perhaps it was a small group of nomadic hunters, following the migration patterns of animals, who stumbled upon this ribbon of life cutting through the landscape. They would have approached cautiously at first, these early people, understanding instinctively that water meant life, but also recognizing that rivers could be both friend and foe. The river, for its part, continued its ancient dance, unaware that it was about to become the foundation of something extraordinary. It flowed as it always had, carrying its cargo of silt and nutrients, supporting the fish that swam in its depths and the birds that nested along its banks. But now, watching from the shores, were eyes that could see beyond the immediate moment, minds that could imagine possibilities that extended far into the future. Those first human settlements were modest affairs, small clusters of simple dwellings positioned strategically near the river, but far enough back to avoid the floods that came with the changing seasons. The people quickly learned to read the river's moods, to understand the subtle signs that indicated when the waters might rise or fall. They discovered that the river had its own calendar, its own rhythm that was tied to the distant mountains where snow melted and rain fell as generations passed. The relationship between the river and the people along its banks deepened and became more complex. The humans began to understand that the river was not just a source of water for drinking and washing, but a highway that could carry them and their goods to distant places. They learned to fashion boats from the trees that grew along the riverbanks, hollowing out logs and shaping them into vessels that could ride the current downstream or be paddled upstream against the flow. The river, in its patient way, began to feel the effects of this new relationship. Where once its banks had been lined only with native grasses and wildflowers, now there were cleared areas where humans had built their homes and planted their crops. The people had discovered that the soil near the river was particularly fertile, enriched by centuries of floods that had deposited layers of nutrient-rich sediment across the floodplains. This discovery led to the birth of agriculture along the river's banks. The humans learned to work with the river's natural flood cycle, planting crops that would benefit from the annual inundation and building simple irrigation channels to direct water to their fields during drier periods. They developed a deep understanding of the river's personality, knowing when it would be generous with its gifts and when it might withdraw its bounty. The river found itself becoming something it had never been before, a partner in creation. Its waters nourished not just the wild plants and animals that had always depended on it, but also the carefully tended crops that fed growing human communities. Wheat and barley, beans and vegetables, fruit trees and grain fields, all flourished in the rich soil that the river had spent. Millennia preparing. As the human settlements grew and prospered, they began to transform from simple farming villages into something more complex and sophisticated. Trade routes developed along the river, connecting distant communities and allowing for the exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies. Merchants learned to read the river's currents and seasons, timing their journeys to take advantage of favorable conditions. The river became a living highway, its surface dotted with boats of increasing size and sophistication. Dugout canoes gave way to larger vessels with sails that could harness the wind to supplement the power of paddle and pole. The people developed techniques for navigating different sections of the river, learning where the water ran deep and swift, where hidden rocks might threaten unwary travelers, and where the current was gentle enough for heavily loaded cargo boats. Time flowed onward like the river itself, and the small settlements along the banks began to grow into something magnificent. Where once there had been simple villages with thatched roofs and muddy pathways, great cities began to rise, their stone foundations rooted deep in the rich earth that the river had created over countless centuries. These cities were marvels of human ingenuity and cooperation, but they were also testament to the river's generosity. Every brick, every stone, every timber beam spoke of the abundance that the waterway provided. The river supplied not just the water needed for construction, mixing mortar, cleaning stone, floating heavy materials downstream from distant quarries, but also the economic foundation that made such grand projects possible. The largest of these cities grew up at strategic points along the river's course, where tributaries joined the main channel, where the water passed through narrow gorges that could be easily defended, or where the river made great bends that created natural harbors and landing places. These locations had been chosen by the river itself, in a sense, carved out over millennia by the patient work of flowing water that had identified the most efficient paths through the landscape. As these urban centers flourished, they developed increasingly sophisticated relationships with their river. Engineers and architects learned to design buildings and infrastructure that worked in harmony with the water's natural behavior. They constructed elaborate systems of canals and aqueducts that could direct the river's flow to every neighborhood, bringing fresh water to public fountains and private homes alike. The river found itself channeled and guided by human hands, but not tamed, for the people had learned, sometimes through bitter experience, that the river would always remain fundamentally wild and unpredictable. They built their cities with this knowledge, creating open spaces and overflow channels that could accommodate the river's periodic surges, and designing their most important buildings to withstand the floods that came with clockwork regularity. Markets and bazaars sprang up along the waterfront, where merchants from distant lands would arrive with exotic goods that had traveled hundreds or even thousands of miles along networks of rivers and overland routes. The river became a nexus of trade and commerce, its docks busy with the loading and unloading of everything from grain and livestock to precious metals and rare spices. The sounds of these river cities were unlike anything the waterway had experienced in its long history. Where once there had been only the gentle lapping of waves against natural banks and the calls of wild birds, now there was the constant hum of human activity, the voices of merchants haggling over prices, the creak of heavily loaded carts, the splash of oars and the snap of sails as boats arrived and departed with the tides and currents. Children grew up along these urban riverbanks with an intimate knowledge of the water's moods and movements. They learned to swim in the rivers, gentle backwaters, to fish in its quiet eddies, and to read the subtle signs that indicated changes in weather or season. For them, the river was not just a geographical feature, but a living presence, as much a part of their daily life as the streets they walked and the buildings they called home. The river, for its part, adapted to this new reality with the same patient flexibility it had always shown. It continued to flow, to carry sediment and nutrients, to support fish and birds and all the other creatures that depended on it. But now it also carried the boats and barges of human commerce, and its banks were lined not just with reeds and willows, but with the carefully constructed walls and buildings of thriving cities. Temples and palaces rose along the most prominent riverbanks, their architects taking advantage of the river's beauty and the cooling breezes that flowed across its surface. These buildings were often designed to incorporate the river into their very structure, with grand staircases leading down to the water's edge and windows, positioned to frame views of the flowing water. The river became not just a practical necessity, but a source of inspiration and wonder. Poets wrote verses about its beauty and power, artists painted its changing moods and colors, and musicians composed melodies that echoed the rhythm of its flow. The waterway had become woven into the cultural fabric of human civilization, as essential to the people's sense of identity as their language or their customs. As the centuries rolled by like the endless flow of water, the relationship between the river and human civilization grew ever more complex and, in some ways, more troubled. The cities along the banks continued to grow, their populations swelling with each generation, and their demands on the river increasing accordingly. What had once been a harmonious partnership began to show signs of strain. The river felt these changes in ways both subtle and profound. Where its waters had once run clear and clean, they now carried new kinds of cargo, the waste and runoff from the great cities, the byproducts of increasing industry and craftsmanship. Tanneries, metalworking shops, textile mills, and other enterprises had sprung up along the waterfront, drawn by the river's convenience for transportation and waste disposal. The fish that had lived in the river for countless generations began to notice changes in their environment. Some species found it increasingly difficult to complete their life cycles, as traditional spawning grounds were altered or polluted. Others adapted, as life always does, finding new niches and new ways to survive in the changing ecosystem. The river's flow itself began to change as human engineering projects grew more ambitious. Dams were constructed to control flooding and provide water for irrigation during dry seasons. These structures, marvels of engineering and testament to human ingenuity, nonetheless altered the ancient rhythm of the river's flow, creating new patterns of high and low water that didn't always align with the natural cycles that wildlife had evolved to depend upon. Canals were dug to redirect portions of the river's flow to new agricultural areas or to connect different waterways for more efficient transportation. Each of these projects solved immediate human problems and brought undeniable benefits to the growing population. But they also represented a fundamental shift in the river's role from a wild natural force to something increasingly managed and controlled by human hands. The river, patient as always, adapted to these changes with the same steady persistence it had shown throughout its long history. It continued to flow around obstacles, to seek the most efficient path toward the sea, and to carry out its ancient work of transporting sediment and nutrients from the mountains to the coastal lowlands. But now it did so while navigating an increasingly complex landscape of human engineering and intervention. Some of the older residents of the river cities, those who remembered their grandparents' stories of earlier times, began to notice that the river seemed different somehow. The spring floods weren't quite as predictable as they once were. The fish weren't as plentiful, and the water itself seemed to have lost some of its clarity and sparkle. These observations were often dismissed as the nostalgia of old age, but they reflected real changes in the river's character and health. Yet even as the river faced these new challenges, it continued to provide the foundation for human prosperity and culture. The great cities along its banks reached new heights of achievement, their libraries and schools and temples standing as monuments to the civilization that the waterway had made possible. Artists and writers, philosophers and scientists, merchants and craftspeople all continued to depend on the river for their livelihood and inspiration. Trade along the river expanded to unprecedented levels, with great cargo vessels carrying goods not just between local settlements but to distant lands, reached through river networks that connected inland areas to seaports and ocean-going ships. The river had become part of a global system of commerce and communication, its local waters carrying goods and ideas that would eventually reach every corner of the known world. Agricultural techniques continued to evolve and improve, with farmers developing increasingly sophisticated methods for harnessing the river's waters for irrigation and crop production. Terraced fields stepped down hillsides to meet the water's edge, and elaborate systems of channels and locks directed the flow to where it was most needed. The landscape itself had been reshaped by the partnership between human intelligence and the river's patient power. Despite the challenges and changes, the river remained a source of wonder and reverence for many of the people who lived along its banks. Religious ceremonies and seasonal festivals continued to mark the important moments in the river's annual cycle, and children still learned the ancient stories that explained the waterway's origin and celebrated its gifts to humanity as our river continued its journey through the heart of human civilization. Something remarkable began to happen. The wiser voices among the people living along its banks started to recognize that the relationship between human society and the waterway needed to evolve if both were to thrive in the centuries to come. These forward-thinking individuals understood that the river was not an inexhaustible resource to be exploited without thought for consequences, but a living system that required care and respect. This new understanding led to innovations in how people interacted with their river. Engineers began designing filtration systems that would clean waste before it entered the waterway. Farmers developed agricultural techniques that reduced runoff and erosion. City planners started incorporating natural floodplains into their urban designs, creating parks and green spaces that could accommodate the river's periodic surges while providing recreational areas for residents. The river, ever responsive to changes in its environment, began to show signs of recovery in areas where these new approaches were implemented. Fish populations started to rebound where pollution was reduced. Wetlands that had been drained and filled were restored, creating habitat for birds and other wildlife, while also helping to control flooding and filter runoff. This period of adaptation and learning represented a new chapter in the long relationship between the river and human civilization. Instead of simply taking from the waterway, people began to understand that they could give back, that they could be stewards and partners rather than just users and consumers. This shift in perspective brought new possibilities and new hope for the future. Artists and writers of this era began to celebrate not just the river's beauty and power, but also its resilience and the importance of protecting it. Their works helped to spread awareness of the waterway's needs and the ways that human actions affected its health. Children learned new songs and stories that emphasized their responsibility to care for the river, that had cared for their ancestors for countless generations. The river responded to these changing attitudes with characteristic patience and gradual recovery. In areas where restoration efforts were most successful, the water ran clearer, wildlife populations grew stronger, and the natural beauty that had first attracted human settlement began to reassert itself. The waterway demonstrated, once again, its remarkable capacity for renewal when given the chance. Trade and commerce continued to flow along the river, but now with greater attention to sustainability and long-term thinking. Merchants and manufacturers began to consider the environmental impact of their activities, seeking ways to prosper while also protecting the waterway that made their success possible. New technologies were developed that allowed for continued economic growth while reducing the burden on the river's ecosystem. The great cities along the riverbanks evolved as well, incorporating green building techniques and sustainable design, principles that worked in harmony with the natural environment. Rooftop gardens helped to filter rainwater before it reached the river, while constructed wetlands treated wastewater naturally. These urban areas became models of how human civilization could coexist beneficially with natural waterways. As this new era of cooperation and stewardship took hold, the river began to prepare for the next phase of its eternal journey, the approach to the sea. But now it would make this final approach as a waterway that had not just survived its encounter with human civilization, but had been enriched and strengthened by it. The partnership between people and river had evolved into something more mature and sustainable, setting the stage for the magnificent climax of the river's long journey from glacier to delta. As our river flows away from the great cities and centers of human civilization, it begins to sense something that has been calling to it throughout its entire journey: the vast, limitless expanse of the ocean. Though still many miles from the sea, the river can feel subtle changes in the air, in the landscape, and in its own behavior that signal the approach of its ultimate destination. The gradient of the land begins to flatten noticeably as the river moves through this transition zone, where once it rushed down steep mountain slopes and carved through resistant bedrock. Now it flows more slowly and gently across broad, low-lying plains. The character of the landscape changes dramatically, with the river spreading out into wider channels and beginning to meander in great, lazy loops across the softening terrain. This is a landscape of subtlety and patience, where changes happen slowly, and the river has time to explore different paths and possibilities. The waterway splits and rejoins, creating islands and backwaters, sloughs and oxbow lakes. It's as if the river is reluctant to complete its journey, taking its time to savor these final miles before surrendering itself to the sea. The wildlife along these lower reaches reflects the river's changing character. Waterfowl that prefer slow-moving or still water appear in great numbers. Herons and egrets, ducks and geese, cranes and ibises. These birds have learned to take advantage of the river's more leisurely pace, feeding in the shallow waters and nesting among the reeds and cattails that grow thick along the banks. Fish populations also change as the river approaches the sea. Species that can tolerate both fresh and salt water begin to appear, preparing for the mixing zone where river and ocean meet. Salmon and other anadromous fish use these lower reaches as staging areas, gathering strength for their spawning runs or beginning their journey to the open ocean. The river's sediment load, accumulated over hundreds of miles of travel, becomes increasingly important in this final stretch. The slower current means that much of the silt and clay that the river has been carrying begins to settle out, creating new land and building up the foundations of what will eventually become the delta. Each flood deposits another thin layer of rich soil, gradually extending the coastline seaward. The influence of the ocean becomes more noticeable with each passing mile. Tides begin to affect the river's flow, causing the water level to rise and fall with a rhythm that is entirely different from the seasonal cycles that have governed the river's behavior in its upper reaches. This tidal influence can extend surprisingly far inland, creating brackish waters where fresh and salt water mix. The river encounters new challenges in this tidal zone. Sometimes the incoming tide is strong enough to actually reverse the river's flow, pushing salt water upstream and creating complex patterns of circulation. The river must learn to work with these tidal forces, finding ways to continue its seaward journey while accommodating the ocean's rhythmic push and pull. Plant life along the riverbanks reflects this mixing of fresh and saltwater influences. Salt-tolerant grasses and shrubs begin to appear, creating unique ecosystems that are neither fully terrestrial nor fully aquatic. These transitional habitats support specialized communities of plants and animals that have adapted to life in the challenging environment where river meets sea. The air itself carries different scents and sounds as the river approaches the ocean. The fresh, earthy smell of river water begins to mix with the briny tang of salt spray. Seabirds appear overhead, their calls adding new voices to the chorus of sounds that accompanies the river's journey. Winds from the ocean bring moisture and coolness, moderating the climate and creating conditions that support different types of vegetation. Human settlements in this region have learned to live with both the river and the sea, developing unique cultures and economies that take advantage of both aquatic environments. Fishing communities harvest the bounty of both fresh and salt water, while farmers have learned to work with the rich, alluvial soils that the river has deposited over centuries. Of flooding, the river itself seems to sense the momentous nature of the transition it is about to undergo. After hundreds of miles of travel, after countless encounters with tributaries and human settlements, after weathering floods and droughts and all the challenges of its long journey, it is finally approaching the end of one phase of its existence and the beginning of another. The fresh water that began its journey as snowmelt and rainfall in distant mountains is about to merge with the vast saltwater ocean that covers most of our planet's surface. Yet even as the river prepares for this ultimate transformation, it continues to perform the work it has been doing throughout its journey. It carries nutrients and sediments that will nourish marine ecosystems. It provides habitat for countless species of plants and animals. It serves human communities and connects inland areas with the wider world. The river remains, even in these final miles, a source of life and abundance, a pathway between different worlds and different ways of being. As we follow our river toward its rendezvous with the sea, we can sense the excitement and anticipation that seems to fill the water itself. The journey that began in ice and snow, high in the mountains, is about to reach its magnificent conclusion in the warm, salt waters of the ocean. But this ending is also a beginning, for the water that the river delivers to the sea will begin a new cycle of evaporation, precipitation, and flow that will eventually bring it back to the mountains where our story began. As our river approaches the end of its magnificent journey, something beautiful and profound begins to happen. After thousands of miles of rushing, tumbling, and flowing with purpose and urgency, the water begins to slow. It's like watching a runner near the end of a marathon, their pace naturally adjusting as they approach the finish line, but instead of exhaustion, there's a sense of peaceful completion in the air. The river has entered what we call the coastal plain, that magical threshold between the land and the sea. Here, the gradient becomes so gentle that the water seems to almost float rather than flow. Where once the river carved through rock and raced down mountainsides, now it meanders in lazy, dreamy curves across a landscape that stretches flat and welcoming toward the horizon. This slowing isn't a sign of weakness or ending, it's a transformation. Think of it like a symphony that has been building to a crescendo throughout the entire performance, and now, in these final movements, the music becomes softer, more contemplative, more profound. The river is preparing for one of the most important acts of its entire existence. As the water slows, it begins to drop the precious cargo it has been carrying all this time. Remember all those particles of soil, sand, and rock that joined our river family along the way, the tiny fragments of mountains, the rich earth from valleys, the countless microscopic treasures picked up from stream beds and riverbanks. All of this material has been traveling with the water, suspended in the current like passengers on a very long journey. But now, as the river's energy decreases, these particles begin to settle. It's a process as old as rivers themselves, following the simple physics of moving water. The largest particles, the sand and gravel, settle first, dropping gently to the riverbed like the first leaves of autumn. Then come the smaller particles, the silt that gives the water its brown or grey color, settling in layers like sedimentary blankets. This process creates something truly remarkable. The river begins to divide itself, splitting into multiple channels that weave through the accumulating sediment like fingers spreading across a table. Each channel carries a portion of the original river's flow, creating a network of waterways that branch and merge, separate and reconnect, in patterns that seem both random and purposeful. The landscape here is unlike anything the river has encountered before. Instead of the solid banks of rock or earth that have guided its path for so long, the channels here are constantly shifting and changing. What is a riverbank today might be a channel tomorrow, and what is a channel today might be dry land next week. It's a dynamic, living landscape that exists in a constant state of gentle transformation. This is the beginning of what we call the Delta One of Earth's most productive and fascinating ecosystems. The word delta comes from the Greek letter that looks like a triangle, and if you were to fly over our river now, you'd see why. The single channel that began as a tiny trickle from our glacier has spread into a fan-shaped network of waterways, creating a triangular pattern that points toward the sea. But the delta is so much more than just a geographical feature. It's a nursery, a garden, a laboratory, and a library all rolled into one. The rich sediments that the river has carried from the mountains contain minerals and nutrients that have been locked in rock for millions of years. As these sediments settle in the delta, they create some of the most fertile soil on Earth. Plants love this environment. The constant supply of fresh water mixing with the nutrients from the sediments creates perfect growing conditions. Grasses and reeds begin to sprout from the newly formed mudflats, their roots helping to stabilize the sediment and create more permanent islands and channels. These plants, in turn, provide food and shelter for countless creatures. The delta becomes a magnet for wildlife. Birds arrive first, drawn by the abundance of fish and insects in the shallow waters. Waterfowl find perfect nesting sites among the reeds and grasses. Wading birds like herons and egrets discover rich feeding grounds. In the shallow channels, migratory birds use the delta as a crucial rest stop, a place to refuel during their long journeys across continents. Fish populations explode in the delta's waters. The combination of fresh water from the river and salt water from the approaching ocean creates a unique environment called brackish water. Many fish species use this transitional zone as a nursery, laying their eggs in the protected channels where their young can grow strong before venturing into the open ocean. Beneath the water's surface, an entire world of smaller creatures thrives. Crabs scuttle across the muddy bottom, their shells eventually becoming part of the sediment when they die. Shellfish, like oysters and clams, filter the water, helping to keep it clean while building their own shells from minerals in the water. Tiny organisms called plankton bloom in the nutrient-rich waters, forming the base of a complex food web that supports everything from small fish to large marine mammals. The delta also serves as a natural water treatment plant. As the river water flows slowly through the maze of channels, plants and microorganisms filter out pollutants and excess nutrients. The sediments trap heavy metals and other contaminants, preventing them from reaching the ocean. Wetland plants absorb nitrogen and phosphorus, natural fertilizers that could cause problems in marine environments if present in too high concentrations. This natural filtration system is incredibly efficient. By the time the river water finally reaches the ocean, it has been cleaned and purified by one of nature's most sophisticated treatment systems. The delta acts like a giant sponge, absorbing and processing everything the river has carried from the land. The formation of the delta is also a story of creation and renewal. Every year, the river brings new sediments to the delta, building up the land grain by grain. Over thousands of years, these deposits can create vast areas of new land. Some of the world's most productive agricultural regions, like the Nile Delta in Egypt or the Mississippi Delta in Louisiana, were built entirely by rivers depositing their sediments over millennia. But the delta is not just a place of ending, it's also a place of beginning. The nutrients and sediments that settle here don't just disappear into the mud. They become part of the ocean's ecosystem, feeding marine plants and animals. Some of these nutrients are carried by ocean currents to distant shores, where they support marine life thousands of miles away. The river's gift to the ocean keeps giving. Long after the fresh water has mixed with the salt dot, as our river flows through its delta, spreading its waters across the landscape like fingers reaching toward an embrace, something magical begins to happen. In the distance, beyond the maze of channels and islands, beyond the waving grasses and calling birds, there's a different kind of water waiting. It's vast, deep, and ancient ocean, the final destination of our river's epic journey. The meeting between river and ocean is not a sudden collision, but a gradual, gentle mixing that happens over miles of coastline. It's like watching two old friends who haven't seen each other in years, slowly walking toward each other across a vast field. Their pace unhurried, because they know that this reunion is inevitable and eternal. At first, the differences between the river water and ocean water are stark. The river water is fresh, carrying no salt, and it's often brown or grey with suspended sediments. The ocean water is salty, clear, and has a different density that makes it heavier than fresh water. When they first meet, they don't immediately blend together. Instead, they form distinct layers, like oil and vinegar in a salad dressing that hasn't been shaken. The fresh river water, being lighter, tends to float on top of the denser salt water. This creates a phenomenon called a halocline zone, where the salt content changes dramatically with depth. If you could dive down through this mixing zone, you would literally taste the water changing from fresh to salty as you descended. But nature doesn't like sharp boundaries, and gradually the two waters begin to mix. Tides play a crucial role in this process. Twice each day, the tide rises and falls, pushing salt water up into the river channels and then pulling it back out to sea. This rhythmic breathing of the ocean creates a zone of mixing that extends far up into the delta, sometimes for dozens of miles, during high tide. Salt water pushes upstream, creating a wedge of denser water that slides beneath the fresh water flowing down from the river. As the tide falls, this salt water retreats, but not before it has mixed with the fresh water above it. This constant push and pull creates a dynamic mixing zone where the chemistry of the water changes throughout the day. The mixing of fresh and salt water creates what scientists call an estuary, one of the most productive ecosystems on Earth. The word estuary comes from the Latin word for tide, and it perfectly describes this tidal zone where river and ocean meet. Estuaries are among the most important habitats on our planet, serving as nurseries for countless species and providing crucial services for both marine and terrestrial ecosystems. The mixing process itself is fascinating to observe. Imagine stirring chocolate syrup into milk at first. You can see distinct swirls and patterns, but gradually the two liquids blend into a uniform mixture. The same thing happens where river meets ocean, but on a much grander scale and over a much longer time period. The process is driven by several forces working together. The tide provides the primary mixing energy, but wind also plays a role, creating waves and currents that help stir the waters. The shape of the coastline influences how the mixing happens. A narrow inlet will create different patterns than a wide open bay. Temperature differences also affect the mixing. River water is often warmer or cooler than ocean water depending on the season, and these temperature differences create convection currents that help the waters blend. In winter, the river might be warmer than the ocean, causing the fresh water to rise and spread across the surface. In summer, the reverse might be true as the waters mix. They carry with them all the materials and nutrients that have traveled with them on their respective journeys. The river brings sediments, organic matter, and terrestrial nutrients. The ocean brings salt, marine minerals, and sometimes microscopic sea life. The mixing zone becomes a melting pot of chemistry and biology, creating conditions that support an incredible diversity of life. Many marine animals depend on estuaries for critical parts of their life cycles. Salmon, for example, are born in freshwater streams far upstream, migrate to the ocean to grow and mature, and then return to the estuary to begin their journey back to their birthplace. The estuary serves as a staging area where their bodies gradually adjust from salt water to freshwater or vice versa. Shellfish like oysters and mussels thrive in the brackish waters of estuaries. They filter enormous quantities of water through their bodies, removing particles and nutrients and helping to keep the water clear. A single oyster can filter up to 50 gallons of water per day, making them crucial partners in maintaining the health of the estuarine ecosystem. The mixing zone also creates unique chemical conditions that support specialized forms of life. Some bacteria thrive in the gradient between fresh and salt water, playing important roles in nutrient cycling. These microorganisms help convert nitrogen and other nutrients into forms that can be used by plants, supporting the entire food web of the estuary. The physical mixing of the waters creates patterns and phenomena that are beautiful to observe. Sometimes you can see distinct color differences where fresh and salt water meet, creating natural art in the water. Foam and bubbles form along the mixing boundaries, creating temporary sculptures that constantly change with the movement of the water during certain conditions. The mixing can create what are called tide bores, walls of water that travel upstream as the tide comes in. These natural waves can be quite spectacular, sometimes reaching several feet in height and traveling many miles up the river. They're like the ocean's way of announcing its presence to the river, a daily reminder of the powerful forces at work. In this meeting place, the estuary also serves as a buffer zone, protecting both the river and the ocean from extremes. During storms, the estuary can absorb much of the ocean's fury, reducing the impact of storm surges on upstream communities. During floods, the estuary provides a space for the river to spread out and slow down, reducing the force of floodwaters before they reach the ocean. This mixing zone is also incredibly important for human communities. Many of the world's great cities are built on estuaries, taking advantage of the protection from ocean storms and the access to both river and ocean transportation. The rich soils of estuarine areas have supported agriculture for thousands of years, and the abundant fish and shellfish have fed coastal communities throughout history. But perhaps most importantly, the meeting of river and ocean represents the completion of one of nature's most fundamental cycles. The water that fell as snow on distant mountains, that flowed through countless streams and rivers, that supported life in forests and valleys and plains, finally returns to the vast reservoir from which it originally came. It's a homecoming that has been millions of years in the making. The ocean welcomes the river water like a parent welcoming a child home after a long journey. The river has seen the world, carried the stories of the land, and now returns to share those stories with the sea. In return, the ocean will eventually lift some of that water back into the sky, beginning the cycle anew. In the heart of where our river meets the sea, something extraordinary unfolds, a living tapestry woven from water, earth, and life itself. The delta ecosystem is like a grand symphony where every instrument, from the smallest microbe to the largest bird, plays its part in creating a harmonious whole that is greater than the sum of its parts. Picture, if you will, a vast wetland that stretches as far as the eye can see. The landscape here is neither fully land nor fully water, but something wonderfully in between. Channels of water wind through islands of vegetation, creating a maze that seems to have been designed by nature's most artistic hand. The water level rises and falls with the tides, revealing mudflats at low tide and submerging them at high tide, creating a rhythm that all life here has learned to dance to. The plants of the delta are true pioneers, capable of thriving in conditions that would challenge most other vegetation. Salt-tolerant grasses called halophytes grow in dense carpets across the mudflats, their roots helping to bind the sediment together and create stable ground. These remarkable plants have evolved special mechanisms to deal with salt water. Some excrete salt through their leaves, creating tiny crystals that sparkle in the sunlight like natural jewelry. Mangroves, where the climate allows, are perhaps the most iconic plants of the delta ecosystem. These trees seem to walk on water, their intricate root systems rising above the surface like the legs of giant spiders. The roots not only anchor the trees in the shifting sediments, but also create a complex three-dimensional habitat that supports countless other organisms. Fish hide among the roots, crabs scuttle across them, and birds nest in the branches above. The timing of life in the delta is orchestrated by the tides, creating a daily rhythm that has persisted for millions of years. As the tide recedes, it reveals vast mudflats rich with marine worms, clams, and crustaceans. This is feeding time for the wading birds, herons, egrets, ibises, and spoonbills who arrive in great numbers to probe the mud with their specially adapted beaks. Each species of bird has evolved to feed at a different depth and on different prey, reducing competition and allowing many species to coexist in the same area. Great blue herons use their long necks and sharp beaks to spear fish in the deeper channels. Smaller egrets wade in the shallows, picking small fish and frogs from the water. Sandpipers and plovers run along the water's edge, their rapid movements creating a ballet of feeding activity. The delta serves as a crucial stopover for migratory birds, some of which travel thousands of miles twice each year. These travelers arrive exhausted and hungry, and the delta's abundance allows them to rest and refuel for the next leg of their journey. The timing of their arrival is often synchronized with peak food availability, a natural coordination that has been refined over millions of years of evolution. Beneath the water's surface, an equally complex world thrives. The brackish water of the delta creates unique conditions that support both freshwater and saltwater species, as well as those specially adapted to live in the transitional zone between the two. Young fish use the delta as a nursery, hiding among the vegetation and feeding on the abundant small creatures that live in the mud and water. Oysters and other shellfish create their own reefs in the delta waters, building three-dimensional structures that provide habitat for countless other species. These filter feeders play a crucial role in maintaining water quality, removing excess nutrients and particles from the water column. Their shells, when they die, become part of the sediment, adding calcium carbonate to the mix of materials that build the delta. The microscopic life of the delta is perhaps its most important component, though often overlooked. Bacteria and other microorganisms break down organic matter, recycling nutrients and making them available to plants. Phytoplankton, tiny floating plants, capture sunlight and carbon dioxide, producing oxygen and forming the base of the food web. Zooplankton's more floating animals feed on the phytoplankton and are, in turn, eaten by larger creatures. The delta's productivity is legendary among ecosystems. The combination of nutrient-rich sediments, abundant sunlight, and constant water circulation creates conditions that support an incredible amount of life. Some delta ecosystems produce more organic matter per unit area than even tropical rainforests, making them among the most productive habitats on Earth. This productivity has not gone unnoticed by humans. Throughout history, people have been drawn to delta regions for their abundant fish, fertile soils, and strategic locations for trade and transportation. Many of the world's great civilizations have flourished in delta regions. The ancient Egyptians along the Nile Delta, the Mesopotamians in the Tigris-Euphrates Delta, and countless others who recognized the life-giving properties of these unique ecosystems. The delta also provides crucial services that extend far beyond its borders. It acts as a natural water treatment plant, filtering pollutants and excess nutrients from the river water before it reaches the ocean. The vegetation and sediments trap carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, helping to mitigate climate change. The wetlands provide flood control, absorbing excess water during storms and releasing it slowly during dry periods. But perhaps most importantly, the delta serves as a bridge between two worlds, the terrestrial world of the river and the marine world of the ocean. Nutrients and energy flow both ways across this bridge. The river brings terrestrial organic matter and nutrients to the sea, while the tide brings marine nutrients and organisms back upstream. This exchange enriches both environments and creates a corridor for species movement between fresh and salt. Water habitats. The delta's landscape is constantly changing, shaped by the competing forces of river deposition and ocean erosion. During flood seasons, the river brings massive amounts of sediment, building up the delta and creating new land. During storms, ocean waves and currents can erode away parts of the delta, redistributing sediment and changing the shape of channels and islands. This constant change creates a dynamic habitat that supports species, adapted to disturbance and change. Some plants and animals have evolved to be pioneers, quickly colonizing new areas as they form. Others are adapted to the temporary nature of delta habitats, completing their life cycles quickly or being able to move to new areas as conditions change. The delta's beauty lies not just in its biological richness, but in its ever-changing nature. No two visits to a delta are exactly the same. Channels shift, islands appear and disappear, and the communities of plants and animals constantly adjust to new conditions. It's a living example of nature's resilience and adaptability, a place where change is not just tolerated but embraced as an essential part of life. As our river finally completes its journey through the delta, it carries with it the essence of all the ecosystems it has touched. The mountain minerals, the forest organic matter, the prairie nutrients, and the delta's own unique contributions all flow together toward the vast ocean that awaits. The river has become more than just water. It has become a liquid lifeline, connecting the entire watershed to the sea. As our river's fresh waters finally surrender themselves completely to the vast embrace of the ocean, we witness not an ending, but a transformation that speaks to one of the most beautiful truths in nature, that nothing truly ends. Everything simply changes form and begins again. The moment when the last traces of our river disappear into the boundless sea is also the moment when the next chapter of its story begins. The ocean that receives our river is itself a river of sorts, a vast, interconnected system of currents that circle the globe, carrying water, nutrients, and life from one corner of the world to another. Our river water, now mixed with salt water, becomes part of this grand oceanic circulation, a system so vast and powerful that it influences weather patterns, climate, and life on every continent. Some of the water molecules that began their journey as snowflakes on our distant glacier will now travel incredible distances. They might flow along the continental shelf, supporting marine ecosystems thousands of miles from where they entered the sea. They might be carried by deep ocean currents to the other side of the world, not seeing sunlight again for decades or even centuries. Or they might be drawn back toward the surface by upwelling currents, bringing deep-sea nutrients to coastal waters and supporting some of the richest fishing grounds on Earth. But the ocean is not just a destination, it's also a launching pad for the next phase of the water cycle. The sun's energy, which has been the driving force behind our river's journey from the very beginning, continues to work its magic on the ocean's surface. Every day, the sun lifts billions of gallons of water from the ocean's surface, transforming liquid into vapor in a process that has been happening since Earth first had oceans. This evaporation is gentle and constant, invisible to the naked eye, but absolutely essential to life on Earth. The water vapor rises into the atmosphere, where it joins the great aerial rivers of moisture that flow through the sky. These atmospheric rivers can carry as much water as the mightiest rivers on land, transporting moisture from the oceans to the continents, where it will eventually fall again as rain or snow. And here's where the magic really happens. Some of the water molecules that our river carried to the sea will eventually return to the very mountains where their journey began. They will rise into the atmosphere, travel with the wind, and fall as snow on the same glaciers that gave birth to our river. It's a cycle that has no beginning and no end, an endless circulation that connects every drop of water on Earth to every other drop. But not all of our river's water will make this direct return journey. Some will fall as rain on different continents, feeding different rivers and supporting different ecosystems. Some will fall into other oceans, beginning entirely new journeys. Some will be taken up by plants, becoming part of their structure, before being released back to the atmosphere through their leaves. Some will infiltrate into groundwater, traveling slowly through underground aquifers for years or decades, before emerging in distant springs. The nutrients and minerals that our river carried to the sea also begin new journeys. The sediments settle to the ocean floor, where they become part of the geological record, preserving the story of our river's journey for millions of years. Marine organisms incorporate these materials into their shells and bodies, and when they die, they contribute to the formation of new rock that might someday be uplifted to form new mountains. The organic matter that our river brought from the land feeds marine ecosystems, supporting everything from tiny bacteria to great whales. The nitrogen and phosphorus that washed from forests and fields nourish marine plants, which produce oxygen and remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. The iron and other trace minerals that our river leached from rocks become essential nutrients for ocean life, sometimes limiting the growth of marine organisms in distant parts of the ocean. Even the thermal energy that our river carried to the sea plays a role in the ocean circulation. Rivers can be warmer or cooler than the ocean water they enter, and these temperature differences contribute to the complex patterns of ocean currents that distribute heat around the globe. This thermal contribution helps regulate Earth's climate, making our planet habitable for life as we know it. The meeting of our river with the ocean also creates something beautiful and ephemeral. Plumes of sediment and organic matter that spread from the river mouth into the coastal waters. These plumes can be seen from space, creating patterns of color in the blue ocean that trace the river's influence far from shore. They are temporary features, lasting only days or weeks before being dispersed by currents and waves. But they represent the river's final gift to the sea. The biological impact of our river's arrival in the ocean extends far beyond the immediate area. The nutrients it brings can trigger blooms of marine phytoplankton, creating temporary oases of productivity in the ocean. These blooms support fish populations, which in turn support larger predators, creating a chain of abundance that can extend for hundreds of miles from the river mouth. Migratory animals use the river's influence as a navigation aid, following the plumes of fresh water and nutrients as they travel along the coast. Sea turtles, whales, and fish can detect the chemical signatures of different rivers, using them as landmarks in their oceanic journeys. Our river becomes part of the invisible map that guides these creatures across the vast ocean. The river's journey to the sea also connects human communities across vast distances. The nutrients that our river brings to the ocean support fisheries that feed people thousands of miles away. The sediments it deposits might eventually be carried by currents to distant beaches, creating new land for future generations. The fresh water it adds to the ocean becomes part of the global water cycle that brings rain to every continent. As we reflect on this incredible journey from glacier to delta to ocean, we can see that our river is not just a body of water flowing from one place to another. It's a thread in the vast tapestry of Earth's systems, connecting the highest mountains to the deepest oceans, linking the smallest microorganisms to the largest ecosystems, and binding together past, present, and future in an endless cycle of renewal. The story of our river is also our story, because we are made of the same water that flows through its channels. The water in our bodies has traveled this same cycle countless times, falling as rain, flowing through rivers, evaporating from oceans, and falling again. We are temporary vessels for this eternal substance, participants in the same grand circulation that drives all life on Earth. And so, as our river disappears into the ocean, we know that it has not ended but transformed. It has become part of something larger, something eternal, something that connects every living thing on Earth. The glacier that gave it birth is still there, still creating new water to begin new journeys. The ocean that receives it is still there, still lifting water into the sky to fall again as rain. The story of our river is the story of life itself, a tale of constant movement, constant change, constant renewal. It reminds us that in nature, nothing is wasted, nothing is lost, everything is transformed. The water that begins as ice on a distant mountain will become rain on a forest, flow through a river, nourish a delta, and return to the sea, only to begin the journey again. This endless cycle is perhaps the most hopeful story in nature. It tells us that renewal is possible, that life finds a way to continue, that the systems that support us are resilient and enduring. As long as the sun shines and the earth turns, the rivers will flow, the rain will fall, and the cycle will continue. Our river's journey from glacier to delta is complete, but it is also just beginning. Somewhere in the vast ocean, molecules of water that began their journey with us are already being lifted into the sky, ready to fall again as rain, ready to begin new rivers, ready to support new life. The story goes on, and we are all part of it, connected by the flowing water that is the lifeblood of our planet. Thank you for staying with me through this peaceful journey into the story of a river from glacier to delta. I hope you've found as much wonder and calm in following up river's path as I have in sharing it with you. There's something profoundly soothing about understanding how water connects everything on our planet, how each drop that falls from the sky is part of an ancient cycle that has been flowing for billions of years. As you go about your day, I invite you to notice the water around you with new eyes, the rain on your window, the stream in your local park. Even the water from your tap, all of it is part of this same magnificent story. Every drop has traveled from mountains to valleys, through forests and fields, and eventually to the sea, only to rise again and continue the journey. If this story has brought you a moment of peace or wonder, consider sharing it with someone who might need that same gentle reminder of how beautifully connected our world is. And if you'd like to explore more stories about the quiet miracles that surround us every day, I'll be here, ready to walk alongside you through whatever gentle adventure we discover next. Until then, take care of yourself, and remember, like the river, you are part of something much larger and more beautiful than you might realize. The same water that carved the Grand Canyon and fills the vast oceans also flows through you, connecting you to every living thing on Earth. How wonderful is that? Sweet dreams, and may your own journey be as peaceful and purposeful as the river's flow to the sea.